Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hi there. How are you doing today? I hope you are all fine. I am the class of stars teacher and I am coming back with another lesson. In today's lesson, I'll talk about another grammar point. Remember in the previous lesson when we learned about the different kinds of relative pronouns and the kind of nouns that each pronoun refers to? Well, today we will learn another important grammar point related to this, which is the relative clause. The relative clause. Okay? Okay. Let's move to the examples. Okay. Now, let's consider these four examples. Number one, the girl who wears a blue jacket is my sister. Number two, this is the book which I read yesterday. Number three, King Abdulaziz, who established Saudi Arabia, was kind. Number four, tennis, which is my favorite sport, is a very old game. Now, remember in the previous video, we called this part of the sentence as the relative clause. Okay? The girl who wears a blue jacket is my sister. Who wears a blue jacket? This is the relative clause. This is the book which I read yesterday. The relative clause here is which I read yesterday. So, which book? The one that I read yesterday. King Abdulaziz, who established Saudi Arabia, was kind. Now, here is the relative clause. King Abdulaziz, who established Saudi Arabia. Tennis, which is my favorite sport, is a very old game. Here is the relative clause, which is my favorite sport. Now, do you know what is the difference between the two examples and between the first two and the second two? Okay, the difference is that the first two relative clauses are very important to define the noun that comes before them. So, who wears a blue jacket here is very important to define the girl. Which girl who wears a blue jacket? So, it gives important information. Also here, we don't know which book, but when I say which I read yesterday, now you know which book. So, here, the relative clause here is very important to define the noun that comes before it, which is book and girl. This clause, we call it defining. Okay, we call it a defining relative clause. Why? Because it defines. Defining in Arabic means معرفة, تعرف. Okay, so it is important because it gives important information. Now, let's look at number three. King Abdulaziz, who established Saudi Arabia, was kind. Now, the relative clause here, who established Saudi Arabia, is not important. It is just giving extra information. Because we all know King Abdulaziz, we don't need this information. So, this information is extra information. Okay? Number four, tennis, which is my favorite sport, is a very old game. Now, we all know tennis. No need to add which is my favorite sport, but it is also extra information. So if I take it out, it will not make any problem. Tennis is my favorite, tennis, sorry, is a very old game. So I understand the meaning without the extra information. Now, in number 3 and number 4, we call this a non-defining. Okay, we call it a non-defining relative clause. Why is it a non-defining? Because it does not define the noun that comes before it. Because we know who's King Abdulaziz and what is tennis. So it's just giving extra information. Okay, so now the first difference between defining and non-defining relative clause is in the information they give. So, information in the defining relative clause is important. But in the non-defining relative clause, it is just an extra information. This is the first difference. The second important difference between the two is that in the defining relative clause, okay, we don't use commas. So as you can see here, in the defining relative clause, there is no commas. But in the non-defining relative clause, you can see here we have the commas. This means that the clause is not important, so we put a comma before and after the clause to show that it is just extra information, it is not important. So you can take out the whole clause and there will be no problem. So the second difference is that in the defining relative clause, no commas. But in the non-defining, use commas. The third important difference is omitting who, which, or that. In the defining relative clause, we can sometimes omit who, which, or that if there is a noun or a pronoun that comes after them. But in the non-defining relative clause, we cannot omit who, which, or that. Let's look at these examples and see what we mean. In the first clause, the first sentence, we have the clause, who wears a blue jacket? So the first thing, you must decide where is the relative clause. So here we have who wears a blue jacket. In number 2, which I read yesterday. In number 3, who established Saudi Arabia, and here, which is my favorite sport. Number 2, you must decide if it is a defining or a non-defining. Number 1, as we said before, defining, and in number 2, a defining, and in number 3, non-defining, and in number 4, non-defining. Now, you look at the first two because they are defining. We can omit who or which if there is a noun or a pronoun after them. So here we have who. Now, what comes after who here? We have a verb, wears. So here, no, we cannot omit who. Number 2, the relative pronoun here is which. Now, what comes after it? We have I, and I is a pronoun. So here, yes, I can omit which, and I can say this is the book I read yesterday. Of course, in number 3 and number 4, we cannot think about omitting who or which because this is non-defining and it is not important, so we don't omit anything here. To sum up our lesson today, we can say that there are three main differences between defining and non-defining relative clauses. Number one, the information in the defining relative clause is important, but in the non-defining relative clause, it's not important, it is extra information. Number two, the use of commas. In the defining relative clause, we don't use commas, but in the non-defining relative clause, yes, we use commas before and after the relative clause to show that it is not important. Number three, omitting who, which, or that in the defining relative clause, yes, we can do that, but if there is a noun or a pronoun after the relative pronoun. But in the non-defining relative clause, no, we cannot omit who, which, or that. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you understood and enjoyed our lesson. And inshallah, see you in the next one. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.